Hey family, it's your favorite integrated plant-based lifestyle coach. My name is Alyssa Nicole, and I'm here with our What's the Research segment. This is a segment where I just find random research articles and I read them, and we talk about them in the comments. Today, again, a lot of my research articles, they do kind of support, they don't necessarily they are all about the same topic. We're all talking about, they're going to be nutrition related, diet related, lifestyle related, every last one of them. So just keep that in mind. I'm not necessarily choosing articles that always support what I believe or my ideas. They are just going to be talking about different topics that I find interesting. So I choose these articles based on the topic. So if you guys have like a topic that you want to discuss and you're like, hey, can you research this and talk about articles based on this topic? Or, hey, could you read this article? I've been reading this research article and I don't understand it. Could you tell me what your viewpoint on it or anything like that? Or just talk about whatever the topic that we're talking about in the paper. So, the reason why I started doing this, What's the Research segment, is because I want to normalize people reading research papers and research articles. I want people to see how they look, and I want to see people, I want people to see like that reading a research article isn't as intimidating as it may seem. Yes, some of them have more or less dense reads than others, so some of them might be a harder reader than others. But for the most part, you can get a lot out of just reading up through an article and figuring it out. So this one that we're reading today, this one is by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And we are going to be reading Adult Dietary and Lifestyle Patterns and Risk of Breast Cancer. So it's a global cancer update program. Systematic literature review. So global cancer update program, CUP global. And so this group, I guess they're assessing dietary and lifestyle patterns and risk of breast cancer. And I'm just gonna scroll down. So you might see me looking down. I always give this disclaimer. It's not because I'm looking off, but I'm looking at my computer screen because I'm reading along too. So that's why I'm kind of looking down. But every research article starts off with an abstract. So let's read our abstract. So I usually just focus on two sections in the abstract. I focus on the background and then the conclusion. So in this one, the background kind of gives an idea of what we'll be talking about in the article. So it says that an increasing number of studies in recent years investigate various dietary and lifestyle patterns and associated breast cancer risk. And so the objective of the study was to examine, was aimed to comprehensively synthesize and grade the evidence on dietary and lifestyle patterns and breast cancer risk. So basically, they're just looking at research, other research, and they are using that to come up with some evidence on how dietary and lifestyle patterns affect breast cancer. And so the conclusions that they have summarized here is basically they have advice to adapt combined aspects of a healthy diet and lifestyle according to the WCRF, AICR, and ACS scores, encouraging a healthy weight, physical activities, alcohol and smoking avoidance, and a healthy diet rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and cereals, and discouraging red and processed meat can be proposed to females to lower breast cancer risk. So basically, they are proposing a plant-based diet and plant-based lifestyle to lower breast cancer risk. Now, they don't necessarily say that you should, they don't mention poultry or eggs or dairy here, so they focus on red meat in this study. But they are promoting a plant-based diet for this study. So let's scroll down and let's go to our introduction. So you might see different colors in my highlights. The colors aren't there because for any reason other than it's just easier for me to read when I'm reading through it. So don't think that I'm trying to highlight different things. It's just easier for me to see and make sure that I get every point. But They start off with the introduction and they talk about how breast cancer is a leading public health problem, and it has over in 2020, at the time of this article, it had over 2.3 million incidences and over 600,000 deaths in females from breast cancer. So this is why they're talking about it, because it's clearly a huge issue. And then they highlight here that it is known that a healthy diet and lifestyle may play an important preventative role. So just moving on, and they talk about how evident and important impacts on breast cancer risk may result from an overall pattern of healthy diet, physical activity, and maintenance of a healthy weight. So it basically is more evident that breast cancer risk may result from that there's an impact on breast cancer risk from healthy diet, physical activity, and maintenance of healthy weight. And that's what we'll be talking about there. And then as we move on, they mentioned the WCRF and the AICR. So that is the 2018, and I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. So that is the 2018 World Cancer Research Fund / American Institute for Cancer Research. And they concluded that the evidence on the relationship of dietary patterns and risk of birth control was inconclusive. And they said although literature on dietary patterns and birth control was abundant, a variety of methods have been used to derive the patterns, which hindered the validity of summarizing the evidence by conventional meta-analytical methods. As such, the Global Cancer Update Program commissioned a group of international experts to establish a systematic literature review protocol to synthesize the evidence following clear eligible criteria and instructions for grouping diet and their lifestyle patterns by deviation methods. So basically, before the World Cancer Research Fund and American Institute, basically they were looking through all of the research and they were having trouble, even though there was an abundance of research about diets and literature that came up with different things, different conclusions. Because the conclusions were so varied, they were having trouble figuring out how to create a conclusive recommendation based upon the research that was out there. And there's a lot of research out there. So that's where the Global Cancer Update Program came in. And basically they said, hey, let's create a systematic approach to dissecting this information so that we can come up with proper recommendations. And so that is kind of what they did, and they used that method here in this research to be able to do that. So it was part of, the CUP Global is formerly known as was formerly the World Cancer Research Fund and American Institute for Cancer Research. And so the protocol is available online. So they have a link here. So if you want to look at that protocol, the link is here. And I've also linked the article to this down there. And I also wanted to, in the description, I linked this article in the description. And I also wanted to look at this. It says risk of bias assessment. And I just wanted to point that out because I was seeing ROB everywhere and I was like, what does that mean? So I wanted to point that out. So if you see ROB, is risk of bias assessment. All right, so I'm going to scroll down and we're going to get into the juicy parts of this. We're going to go right to the results. So basically the rest of this article, they talk about their methods of basically how they synthesize the data. They talk about the research strategy, selection criteria, data extraction. So this is the boring stuff. I would recommend reading it because this part gives information on basically how they chose their data, what strategy they used in order to extract that data. It gives all of that information there. It talks about the risk of bias assessment, how they did the risk of a bias assessment, and then how did they put their data together. So all of these parts in the research paper are very important to read over. I'm only not reading over them because it's not the most interesting thing to read, and I want to keep you engaged. So if you want to go back and know exactly how they put on the study, feel free to read those back. So we're going to skip over to the results. So here they said that they had 3,024 publications screened, 84 were included. So and 77 of those were observational studies, and 3 of them were RCTs. And they reported different lengths of follow-up or birth control subtypes. Okay. So this is why I talked about this being a very dense read. I had to read over this article several times to really understand what was going on, and that's okay because some of them would be a lot more difficult to read than others. And it's only because the fact that they use so much different information, understanding how they talked about different things, what does certain different things mean, and we'll kind of talk about that of what they're talking about. So they had 25 observational studies, and observational studies are basically studies where they kind of observe people over a length of time. And during those observational studies, they examined associations between priori, dietary, and lifestyle scores and birth control risk. And as you can see, they kind of have different categories of what each means. And I'm going to actually just skip down to this chart because it kind of explains it a lot more. So in this chart, as you can see, it talks about these are the subgroup and pattern name. So the pattern name is a priori dietary and lifestyle pattern, and then the subgroup will be based on specific recommendations for cancer prevention based on general recommendations for a lifestyle. And here it gives about the different types of diets. So you have the WCRF and ACR score, you have the ACS scores, healthy lifestyle index, and different scores. And what they did was they basically put the number of publications used, then their score versions, and then they talked about what the recommendations were. So in this key down here, it says dark color is used to indicate a higher intake, positively loaded food groups in most of the patterns. Also, so the dark color is used to indicate a higher intake. The light green color is used to indicate a higher intake, positively loaded specific subgroups in some of the patterns. So this is in most. The light green is in some. The dark red is to indicate lower intake of food groups in most of them, and then light red is used for lower intake in specific food groups. Yellow is to indicate a moderate intake. So as you can see, and these are the recommendations. So these are what they're recommending based on the diets. So dark green, as you can see, we're just going to look at that first line. They recommend physical activity. They recommend fruits, vegetables, grains, and cereal. They recommend some legumes. They don't recommend smoking, and they also don't recommend alcohol, red meat, or sugary and processed foods. But they recommend some sodium, maybe very little sodium, and very little smoking. So, and then no alcohol at all. All right. So, and we move back up. And let's go down. All right. So when we see here, the next category was a priori dietary and lifestyle patterns based on specific recommendations for cancer prevention. So they had 18 publications. And in this one, and we can see that one was mentioned. So we're here. And so they said the scores here encourage a healthy weight, physical activity, a plant-based diet, and discourage red and processed meat and alcohol consumption. And they told us to see two components in table 1. This is table 1. So you can kind of see it here, what they recommend. And it says, notably, results were consistent in the direction of an inverse association independently of menopausal status, with several studies showing strong evidence of an association. So they said that there was an inverse association, and an inverse association means that with the increase of utilizing that pattern, so the encouragements or the recommendations from ACS, which is encourage a healthy weight, physical activity, a plant-based diet, and discourage red and processed meat and alcohol consumption. When those recommendations were better adhered to, breast cancer risk decreased. That's what that inverse relationship means. It means that one goes up, the other goes down. So if you don't follow the recommendation, your risk of birth control increases because you're not adhering to the recommendations. So recommendations, birth control, recommendations, birth control, breast cancer risk decreases. Don't adhere, breast cancer risk increases. That's what that inverse relationship means. And then basically it says that in particular, all 14 studies conducted on all females indicated lower breast cancer risk. So, and then it talks about in postmenopausal females, they said inverse associations were observed in 7 of 8 studies, because only about, I think they said 8 studies talked about post menopausal women, and so those women, there was an inverse relationship, and then they were showing a strong evidence of association. So, and that's with the recommendations of the American Cancer Society. So, okay, so then we go down and we're talking about lifestyle patterns based on general recommendations for healthy lifestyles. So these are just general recommendations. So this will include your health index. This will include the Healthy Lifestyle Index, the Health Index on French recommendations, and the World Health Organization Dietary Guidelines for America, and the French National Nutrition Health Program Guideline Score. So those are your general recommendations for healthy lifestyle. So those pretty much are like your recommendations coming from a governmental entity. So they identified 8 publications, and the patterns from the group they shared were they assessed BMI, they assessed physical activity, smoking, and diet, and mostly fruits and vegetables. So maintaining healthy weight, how much physical activity, limiting smoking, and then encouraging fresh fruits and vegetables. And they found with these that there was an inverse association was identified in all studies regardless of menopausal status, with several studies showing strong evidence of association. So then there was a period dietary patterns. So this one observed 26 observational studies. Similarities among all of these patterns include the combination of a high consumption of fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, whole grains, and cereal, fiber, olive or other vegetable oils that are high in unsaturated fats or low and saturated fatty acid ratio, as well as low consumption of red and processed meat, sugar, sweetened beverages, and sodium. And it says incidence of birth control was a predominant outcome. So with this one, I guess it says a predominant outcome. So it looks like there was a big outcome from these in particular studies, that it was pretty dominant. Like there was, I guess, lots of instances of birth control. I keep saying birth control because it says BC, breast cancer. Okay, and then it talks about tables 8 and 9 talk about it more. I honestly don't know where tables 8 and 9 are. I only see 2 tables listed here, so if you can find another table, let me know. Then it says here, now we're going to go based upon culturally defined dietary habits. So this is dietary patterns based on adherence to eating behaviors, traditions, or even fad diets, often believed to inherently healthy. So these are Mediterranean diet. These are your Mediterranean diet, and pro-vegetarian plant-based diets and other paleo diets. So it goes through each of the diets individually. So the Mediterranean diet, they identify 16 publications, which the Mediterranean diet encourages intake of vegetables, legumes, fruits and nuts, cereals, fish and seafood, unsaturated fats, and a moderate intake of alcohol, and discouraged intake of dairy, meat, and meat products. So they said it was a tendency towards an inverse association between a higher adherence to a Mediterranean diet and breast control risk among postmenopausal women. And it says 9 studies showed an inconsistent association with breast cancer incidence. It says 9 associations were positive and 5 were inverse. So we're going to go down, and now we're going to talk about pro-vegetarian plant-based dietary patterns. It says the original pro-vegetarian diet, it says it scores positively weighs consumption of plant-based foods, obviously, and animal foods are negatively, and independent of their quality. So they're not looking at what the quality was. They just say that plant-based foods are positively weighed, animal foods are negatively weighed. And they also, for this one, they separated between a healthy dietary pattern when it comes to plant-based and then an unhealthy. And what they said with a healthy plant-based, and that's obviously one that sticks to whole foods, it said there was a lower risk of breast cancer in all females. But in the unhealthful pattern, so this was usually when they did adhere to a plant-based diet, but they might not eat enough fruits and vegetables. Maybe they were on a high carb, so they might eat things that were not, they wouldn't eat fresh fruits, legumes, things like that. They would do more like potatoes and processed foods, things like that. Those were associated with a higher risk. And then other culturally plant-based patterns, so they did the Paleolithic or the traditional Mexican diet. So the Paleolithic diet increased breast cancer risk and the Mexican diet decreased risk. Right. So with all of that, and then I'm going to stop right here, take a pause. We're going to scroll back up and we're going to look at this. So this table 2 chart kind of goes even more in depth into each of those categories that we've been talking about, the pattern, and then it talks about whether it was menopausal, because they looked at in all females and then in postmenopausal, and in some of them even in premenopausal. So it kind of goes through this takes all of those words and it summarizes them into the chart. So if you want to look at this will be a great thing to look through if you click this article when you're done, because it kind of goes through everything that we're talking about in detail, in a summarized fashion. Okay, so now let's go down and so these are posterary I cannot talk. Posterary dietary patterns. So basically these are dietary patterns that aren't the best, that are usually not recommended. So they talk about the Western meat or alcoholic dietary patterns. So overall, Western meat and alcohol patterns were characterized by high consumption of red meat and processed meat, snacks, sweets, ultra-processed foods, potatoes, eggs, refined grains, and cereals, and some of them also included sugar sweetening beverages, alcohol, dairy, poultry, and animal fats. And they said even though that the results were inconsistent, a tendency for an association between a higher consumption of Western meat alcohol patterns and increased overall and postmenopausal breast cancer risk was observed. So they didn't come to conclusive evidence, but they did see that there was an association there. And most of the associations were positive associations that they did come up with. For the prudent vegetarian and Mediterranean dietary patterns, there was a tendency for inverse associations and breast cancer risk among all in premenopausal females. And it says that nearly all the studies had an inverse relationship. So, yeah. And these are just some more additional analysis. So I'm just going to read through my highlights a little bit here. So only the Western meat alcohol dietary patterns that included high alcohol consumption or studies with less risk of bias due to confounding and missing data were slightly consistency associated with increased risk. So the ones that had more with less risk of bias and had high alcohol consumption showed an increase of breast cancer risk. So with less bias, and bias is usually that the person that's paying for the study, like McDonald's paying for a study to prove that their food doesn't, or a company, I wouldn't even say McDonald's, a company is paying for a study to prove that their products are good for sale, would be like a bias. And the ones with less bias had more increased risk of breast cancer in all postmenopausal females. And then studies without the alcohol component, or the ones with more, so if they had more included the alcohol, then your risk of breast cancer went up. And then there was a tendency towards an inverse relationship between prudent, vegetarian, and Mediterranean. And then they said that there was a greater evidence of lower risk when they included several lifestyle components over just solely one part of the diet. So if they just focused on diet, they found that when they focus on diet, your weight, your exercise, physical activity, more things, then those patterns kind of change. Like your risk of there were a lower risk of breast cancer. And so there were some evidence that were inclusive, but there was there was an inverse relationship association with a higher adherence to a healthier dietary pattern. So, all right, and then we're going to move into the discussion part, which the discussion kind of reiterates everything that we talked about. Basically saying that a higher adherence to a healthy dietary patterns include diet and other lifestyle factors such as physical activity. When those were included, those show an inverse association. Combined dietary and lifestyle patterns were based on advice to maintain a healthy weight, be physically active, and consume moderate to zero alcohol, and follow a healthy diet. And then they said that based on these recommendations, the dietary components that were associated with lower breast cancer risk was a high consumption of fruits and vegetables, whole grains and cereals, low consumption of red meat, processed meat, and an inverse association was found for those independently of menopausal status. Okay. And then they also talked about how the Western meat alcohol dietary pattern was generally consistent in the positive direction, and that patterns that included high alcohol consumption were slightly more consistently associated with a higher risk. Okay. So again, basically, like we said in the beginning, there was, in conclusion, there was a strong probable evidence that a higher adherence to those dietary and lifestyle scores, decreases breast cancer risk in all postmenopausal females, so all women, no matter of menopausal status. And yeah, so I guess what we recommend based on this study is to eat healthy, manage your weight, be active, lower your consumption of alcohol, and that's the recommendation. And I want to know what you think about this study. And I just want to acknowledge, also when we scroll down, also acknowledge the author contributors, whether there are any conflicts of interest, and they said no, there weren't any conflict of interest. The people who funded is also important, and the people who funded were the World Cancer Research Fund, the World Cancer Research Fund, the Cup Global Commission grant. So it doesn't look like there was any person funding this that was I don't know, the Committee of Plant-Based Eaters or something like that would cause for a conflict of interest. So yeah, at the end, I'd like to acknowledge the references. If you want to learn about all the articles, the research that they use to create this, please dive into the other research articles that are there. They have a ton of research articles. But yeah, I just want to know, what do you think? What do you think? What came to your mind after going through this? I know I kind of went through it pretty quickly, but what came to your mind? What did you think about after you read this? It definitely made me think, and it made me think about how being conscious about your choices, your day-to-day choices, has a huge impact on your overall health. And I think that's important. I think that's extremely important to understand and know and be confident about. I know we only live once, but I think that we should live the best quality life that we can possibly live. And if there is evidence out there that can show that there are relationships between what we do every day, what we consume every day, between certain illnesses, then I want to know that, because I want to do everything I can to prevent them. So let me know how this made you feel in the comments, and we'll keep this going. And I'll see you on the next one. The next one, we are going to be talking about, reduced red and processed meat consumption is associated with lower diet cost. So we're just going to be talking about the cost of it. Is it more expensive? Is it not? And I think this one would have some very surprising data for you as well. So I will see you at the next one. And don't forget to like and subscribe and to leave a comment. Talk soon.